When Minos came to the throne, there were those who said it should have been his brother who was king. And so Minos prayed to Poseidon, lord of the ocean wave, and said to him, Poseidon, give me a sign. Show that your support is for me and not for my brother. And so Poseidon spoke to Minos in a dream and said, I will send to you the whitest, the purest, the most wonderful bull you could possibly imagine. For this is one of my sacred animals, and you show it to the people, you parade it through town, you let them see that the gods of Olympus approve of your kingship, and then you return the bull whence it came, you offer it in sacrifice and send it back in smoke to distant Olympus. And this is almost what happened. For the bull emerged from the sea as white as milk, as white as bleached bones, a creature of beauty. And when Minos saw it, he was delighted, he was overwhelmed. Poseidon had approved of him, and the beast was paraded through the streets of the city. People came out in their thousands to see it and cheer not only the will of the gods being made known, but to cheer Minos as the true king upon the throne. But, and here is the but, the sight of the beast so moved Minos that he could not bear to part with so wonderful a bull, so magnificent a bull. Instead, he substituted at the great ritual of sacrifice one of his own bulls, a great bull, a fantastic bull, a beautiful bull, but not the white bull. And Poseidon was not pleased. The seas churned, they crashed upon the shores, they tore down great chunks of rock from the cliffs, they sank boats, they drowned fishermen and sailors and travellers and merchants. But still Minos would not relent, and so the hand of Poseidon stretched down from the heavens, or possibly up from the oceans, depending on where Poseidon had been at the time, and had its revenge upon that recalcitrant king. It touched the heart not of the king himself, but of his wife Pasiphae, and it moved her to a new kind of love. If Minos loved the bull as a possession, Pasiphae loved the bull as something she wanted to possess in the most dirty way. And so she commissioned the smith, the inventor, the artificer Daedalus, to come and shape a statue, a life-size statue of a cow, made out of bronze but made hollow, with a trapdoor so that she could enter into it and position herself in such a way that when the bull saw this magnificent, this wondrous cow, this creature of metal, but looking so convincing to the eyes of the bull that it did what bulls invariably do and mounted the metal statue, it entered in through an entirely different trapdoor and into the queen herself. And how she survived without hemorrhaging is anyone's guess. But the bull did as nature commands, and Poseidon ensured that the one thing led to another, and the queen grew pregnant. She grew fuller and fuller and heavier, far more swollen than any woman had ever been in the history of pregnancies. Any woman, at least, who had given birth to a human child, for what was in Pasiphae's womb was most decidedly not human. And come the day when she finally gave birth, again how she did not bleed to death and hemorrhage upon the spot is anybody's guess, but perhaps we'll put that down to the sheer talent of the midwives and the surgeons to save Pasiphae. She gave birth to a child which its head was not a human head. It resembled nothing so much as its father, that wonderful white bull. But she nurtured it. She loved it as only a mother could, or at least only a mother whose mind has been touched by the hands of the gods, of the vengeful gods, could. She nurtured the beast at her breast, as a cow may nurture a calf at her udders. And the child grew, and grew, and grew. And if her husband, not the father of the child, her husband Minos, was horrified at his wife's actions and at the thing she had given birth to, well, he was wise enough to realize this was not her fault, but a vengeance upon him and his house for his own unwillingness to fulfill the oaths that he had made. The child, the Minotaur, was hidden well away. And it grew at a phenomenal rate. It got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until it was way beyond needing its mother's milk and turned to other things, not, as you might imagine, the usual things that a bull would eat, grass and cud in the field. Oh no, 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 no. This was a creature of carnivorous appetites. It would snatch up rats from the floor of the nursery and bite their heads off and swallow them down, bones and all. And soon it was moving on to all manner of bigger and bigger and bigger beasts. And whenever they attempted to introduce this Minotaur into the company of other small children, well, those small children were lucky if they survived without a chunk being bitten out of them, and some of them did not survive at all. And it reached the point where the king, where Minos turned in despair and nearly tearing what little hair he had left out of his head, went to the oracle at Delphi and said, "What can I do this? Well, it's no child of mine, but it is a child of the gods. It is a child of my wife. It is a child of my house. I can scarcely kill my own kin. What should I do?" And the Delphic oracle, inhaling the fumes that emerge from the great cracks within the earth, sitting chanting off on a distant journey into the realm of spirit, came back with the message that he should have built by the very same hand that had constructed that bronze bull. He should have built a labyrinth, a vast, rambling labyrinth with corridors and dead ends and false doors and all manner of trickery, and that the Minotaur should be kept within. And there it should live the remainder of its life, which, of course, being a child of the gods, might be a very, very long life. And as to feeding the beast, well, in the short term, they could, of course, put in whatever unfortunate goats or birds or fish of the sea they wanted, but what it really craved, what it really needed to nurture its flesh and its soul and its spirit was human meat. And so they considered their options. And whilst they were considering their options, the legitimate son and heir of Minos and Pasiphae, the older brother of the Minotaur, Androgeus, himself met with a sticky end. He had been attending the Athenian Games as a competitor, not as an observer, for he was a great athlete in his own right. Like many royals turn to sports and excel at horse racing or archery or fencing or some skill or sport or another, he excelled at the athletic arts. He leapt, he twisted, he turned, he danced. He was like a ballet dancer in build. He was amazingly athletic. And in those Athenian Games, he won prize after prize after prize after prize, putting the noses out of joint of all the Athenian competitors and all of their fans, and all of the people who had placed bets on their favourite Athenian athlete winning this match, that match, some other match, until the mob of Athenians, so outraged that this damned foreigner had come in and wiped the board clean of all of the prizes and trophies, rose up in an irate mob consisting of the gamblers and the sports fans and the athletes themselves, and they kicked 7 shades out of Androgeus until he was nothing but a bloody mess upon the floor, his life and his brains and his heart's blood leaking into the cobblestones. And when word was brought to Minos and Pasiphae, they were heartbroken, as any parents would be. And Minos swore vengeance upon the people of Athens, that he would wage an unending war against them unless they would come to terms. And such was the wrath and the might of Minos's rage and the armies at his disposal that the people of Athens quickly agreed to the unnatural terms that he demanded of them. For he had seen a way in which he could both avenge himself and feed his other remaining stepson, for lack of a better word. He demanded of the people of Athens that every single year they should deliver unto him 7 of their finest, bravest, boldest young men, athletes all, and 7 of the most beautiful young women, unwed, unmarried, yet to be mothers, yet perhaps to be anything other than maidens. These 7 of each would be brought upon a ship with black sails as befits a funereal barge, and they should be delivered to the Isle of Minos, and there the king would have his warriors, his servants, lead these 14 unfortunate youngsters to the door of the labyrinth and shove them through, slam the door behind them. Into the labyrinth they would wander, deeper and deeper, some turning left, some turning right, each getting lost in their own turn, whilst the Minotaur, scenting fresh meat within his darkened, fetid labyrinth, would hunt them down one by one at his leisure. And some he would eat there and then, and some he would merely butcher and hang upon hooks, their blood and their gizzards dripping into the soil floor of the labyrinth, ready to be eaten tomorrow, next week, next month, for human flesh, like pheasants hung in a butcher's shop, is said by those who have tasted it to improve with the hanging. And of course the labyrinth itself, unlike Greece above land, above soil, which is very hot, the labyrinth being deep within the earth was very, very cold. It was rather like hanging meat in a fridge. And those 14 corpses would keep the Minotaur well fed for the duration of the year, supplemented by the occasional goat or the occasional bit of fish or chicken or whatever that his family and servants would chuck down into the labyrinth, for none of them dared go in to visit him, for by this point he had become so deranged by his experiences in the labyrinth, living in a slaughterhouse, that he was no longer safe even for his relatives. Well, this habit rolled on for 2 years, the offering of the 7 victims to be devoured. And whilst nobody in Athens quite knew exactly what would happen to these 7 people, they knew that they would all die, that they would never be seen again, these 7 young men and the 7 young women. And it was with a heavy heart that their families packed them off upon the ships. And such was the way of things that initially the king had said he would pick the 7, but the people of Athens said they would rise up and slaughter their own king if this happened. And so a lottery was instituted, in which the names of all the young men of athletic disposition and all of the young maidens unwed would be placed into a great cauldron, and 7 of each would be drawn out. So no one quite knew who was going to die until the lottery was called, and there was no partiality or favouritism to it. Rich or poor or middle class, any of them could end up hanging from a hook in the Minotaur's labyrinth. Till the day that Theseus, one of the greatest, bravest, boldest, most athletic young men of Athens, said he would tackle the king of Minos, the beast to which they were all being offered. He would deal with the problem. He would end the debt of Athens. And so he insisted that his name be one of the 7 that were drawn out of the hat. And his father, the king, Aegeus, heavy-hearted, broken-hearted, nonetheless could see that something had to be done, or this would go on for year after year after year after year. Who knew how long the unnatural son of King Minos, well, alleged son of King Minos, would go on living for. And he said to Theseus when they stood upon the docks as the other 13 victims shuffled weeping onto the ship to take them across to the island, across to their demise. He said to his son, when you sail out under the black sails of sacrifice and death. If you survive and come back, make sure the captain of the ship puts up white sails, so I will know that you at least, if none of these others, you at least, my son, my beloved, you have survived. You have come back. And Theseus, like all good sons, swore to his father, yes, Dad, I'll do that. And off they went. To the island of Minos and Pasiphae they arrived, and their first night, as the first night of all of the previous sacrificial victims had been, they were wined and dined. Royally, regally, and at first, like all of the previous victims, they thought, is this some weird trick? Have we all just been led astray? Maybe the other previous victims are not dead, they've all been well treated, they are somewhere in the palace. Servants, courtiers, who knows? But they were soon to learn otherwise. At this banquet, there was Ariadne. And Ariadne, the daughter of Minos and the daughter of Pasiphae, lost her heart to Theseus during that somewhat morbid banquet meal. She knew what had happened to all the previous sacrifices. She knew what would happen to these. She saw Theseus, who was trying to be in good spirits, trying to keep his fellow Athenians buoyant, funny and charming and clever and handsome and brave and bold, and of course awfully rich. And, well, she lost her head, she lost her heart, she fell for him. And she could not bring herself to think that this lovely young man would be hanging from a hook, devoured by her half-brother. And so she came up with a plan. She slipped out of the banqueting hall and went to her rooms, and there she rummaged, and with the aid of a servant she found what she was looking for. And she slipped back into the hall, seemingly having just visited the littlest room in the palace. And she sat next to Theseus, and as the wine flowed and the banter flowed, and she waited until everyone was sufficiently in their cups and distracted that when she slipped something into Theseus's hand and whispered into his ear, no one paid any much attention. And Theseus looked into his hand, and what he saw was a great ball of thread, something which Ariadne's servants had brought to her for use on weaving, for she was a great and accomplished weaver. And what she whispered into his ear was that he was about that very next morning at the crack of dawn to be shown from his bed into a labyrinth occupied by a monster. And it was easy to get lost in that labyrinth. The monster knew every twist and turn, every nook and cranny. It had been there for years. But of course, neither Theseus nor any of the other sacrifices would know their way around it. And so it was easy to become disoriented, and being disoriented made them much more vulnerable to the attack of the Minotaur. So she recommended to him that once they were all in and the door was slammed shut behind them, they should tie one end of the thread to the handle of the door and follow it till such time as they had defeated the Minotaur, and then they would easily be able to follow the thread back the way they had come and find their way out of the maze. The banquet was completed. They were all shown to their beds, heavily guarded at the door to make sure none of them left it in the night. And there, some of them passed out into a drunken heap, and others sat up fretting and sobbing to the wee small hours. And Theseus himself sat planning till the wee small hours. When the servants came and the soldiers came to escort them from their bedrooms, down to the lowest level of the palace, where the great wooden door studded with iron, heavy and unbreakable was. Everyone, young men and young women alike, were weeping and sobbing to think of what must await them on the other side of this door. The only one not to weep and not to sob was Theseus himself. In to the maze they were shoved into the labyrinth, and the door slammed behind them, and on the walls of this labyrinth were burning wooden torches to light the way. And as they all milled around, weeping and shivering and shaking, they heard the terrible bellowing roar of the distant beast, somewhere within the heart of the labyrinth, echoing down the endless passages and corridors. They smelt the terrible stench of, let's face it, bullshit that littered the corridors of the labyrinth, and they smell the old smell of a carnal house, the blood, the offal of all of the previous victims that had dried and festered in corners of the corridors. And whilst the 13 young men and women were heaving the 14th, was busy tying one end of the thread, the weaving thread, to the door handle. And off they went, he in the lead, turning some left and some right, calling to them to all stay together. But if you've ever been in a situation where you're surrounded by very, very, very frightened people, you will know that it's like herding cats. They don't all stick together. And some of them went this way and some of them went that, and occasionally there would be a terrible, terrible scream cut short by a splatter and a thud, followed by a bull's triumphant roar. Deeper and deeper they went, with no daylight. It was impossible to tell whether they'd been there for 1 hour, or 5 hours, or days on end. Who could tell? They were exhausted. They wandered and they wandered and they wandered. This vast, vast maze. And every now and then they would see gnawed bones, thigh bones and arm bones and rib cages and skulls, some of them stamped upon by hooves or gored and gouged by the great horns of the Minotaur. A terrible sight it was, and things you don't even want to think about and imagine. But at length they came to a turning, and on the other side, as the corridor branched round, Theseus came face to face with the 8-foot-tall Minotaur, great enormous horns from his head, pawing and stamping the ground, roaring and bellowing. The Minotaur was unarmed, for with those enormous horns and those huge, great, brawny hands, what weapon did he need? Theseus had brought a dagger from the dining table, as best that he could, the only weapon he could sneak under his clothing. His father had given him a sword, but the sword was a small one. But they battled as best they could. Theseus, surrounded by the screaming, shouting, howling, fearful companions that were still left by his side, they running this way and that, he heading it off with the Minotaur's horns scraping the sides of the labyrinth, roaring and thundering, striking out at him, biting at him. Theseus, stabbing first with the sword from that his father had given him, then stabbing with a small blade he had taken from the dining table, cutting and hacking and ripping and tearing at each other. Theseus getting wounded, blood gouting up the walls, the Minotaur getting wounded, its blood gouting up the walls, unused to ever being attacked by anyone, roaring and thundering. At length the Minotaur began to panic as blow after blow fell upon his body. For Theseus, frightened though he was an athlete. He could leap and turn and twist and slide under and behind and around the Minotaur, just as the bull leapers do in the arena. He was agile and confident and brave, and for all of his heart was pounding with fear. He was able to control his mind and focus on his survival. And as blow after blow fell upon the Minotaur, eventually it turned tail and fled. Theseus running behind it, stabbing and stabbing and stabbing and hacking at the back of the Minotaur. And as it turned and fled, the great horns were so huge, it found itself trapped and almost immobile within the narrower corridors of the labyrinth, until at length, from blood loss, maybe from one lucky blow that penetrated through into the heart, who can say, that the Minotaur collapsed to the floor. And Theseus finished the beast off. He survived. Most, not all, but most of his fellow Athenians survived. and they were able to find the dropped thread. It was somewhere in the labyrinth at the end of the ball of thread, and follow it all the way back to the great iron door. And then they beat upon that door, beat upon the wooden panels and the iron studding, until the soldiers, their attention was drawn on the other side. Was this the Minotaur itself trying to break down the door? They were quaking with fear, they didn't know. But they cracked the door open just a bit to see what was on the other side, and there Theseus and the others, triumphant with victory, brave and bold now with victory, wrenched open the door, beat the soldiers to a pulp, took their swords off them, and burst out through the palace, killing anyone who stood against them. And there, as she promised she would have been, was Ariadne upon the docks, waiting with a small ship that she had arranged by bribing a sailor, praying and hoping to all of the gods of Olympus that her beloved Theseus would save her, would save her, save himself from the Minotaur, save his fellow Athenians, but not that she was bothered about them, but that he would save them from the Minotaur and come and rescue her from the island. For she knew, once her father and her mother found out that she was complicit in this hopefully successful murder of her brother, half-brother, then, well, her life would not be worth living. And there she saw them, this bunch of blooded, mudded, stained and ragged Athenians racing down the steps towards the dock, triumphant. And she knew, if they had escaped the labyrinth, she knew her brother, half-brother, the Minotaur, would be dead, and her days upon the island numbered. And there she directed them to the boat, and they all raced upon the boat, she included, and they were off as fast as the sails would take them. Well, they went and they went and they went. And one thing led to another, and I won't go into the details for it will make this story far longer, but they stopped upon the Isle of Naxos to wash themselves of the blood and the filth and the detritus of the labyrinth, to find food, to find rest, when they were sure that no ships of Minos were following them. And all of the while, as the adrenaline began to subside in Theseus, and he thought of his escape and what lay ahead of him in the future, grateful as he was that Ariadne had helped him, he could not imagine being married to her, that she should sit upon the Athenian throne one day when his dear old father was dead and he himself became king. He couldn't imagine Ariadne. Besides him, there are other gods back in Athens he'd much sooner have. And, well, ungrateful git that he was, he ditched Ariadne upon the Isle of Naxos. And they all snuck away back upon the ship, the sailors and the surviving members of the Athenian sacrificial party. Off they went, away and away and away. And so triumphant were they at their survival of the horrors that they had witnessed upon the Isle of Minos. So relieved was Theseus to not only have survived the bull monster, but to have ditched this clinging woman, Ariadne, that he forgot his promise. Callow youth that he was, he forgot his promise to his own father, to tell the captain of the ship to change those black sails to white ones. And so when they came within sight of Athens, there was the king, there was Aegeus, and the parents of all of the other boys and girls upon the ship, watching and looking and hoping and praying and wondering and weeping and sobbing, and there they saw the return of the ship with its black sails, and every single parent there sobbed and screamed and howled and thought, Theseus has failed, all of our children are dead, and there will be more next year and next year and next year. And Aegeus himself, the king, having lost his own son, having seen his people, or at least he believed, condemned to year after year of relentless sacrifice, overwhelmed by guilt and by grief, hurled himself into the ocean, which has been known ever since after him as the Aegean Ocean. And when the ship docked, and Theseus and all of the others came aboard, to the great joy and surprise of their grief-stricken parents, to realise that actually they had survived after all, the moment was tarnished for Theseus when he was told what had befallen his father because of his own stupidity, his own forgetfulness, his own self-obsession. And what became of Theseus then? Well, that is another story and the end of this one. Thank you.